Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Carrie Enright-Cato, Director of the Office of Climate Change, Technology, and Research at Connecticut DEEP. Welcome to Exploring Climate Solutions webinar series. The series is brought to you by the Governor's Council on Climate Change. On April 22nd, 2015, Governor Malloy issued an executive order creating the Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3. The Council is charged with examining the efficacy of existing policies and regulations designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and identify new strategies to meet the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. The Council is composed of 15 members from state agencies, quasi-state agencies, businesses, and nonprofits. To learn more about the GC3, please go to www.ct.gov/deep/GC3. So the webinar series explores innovative and successful climate change solutions in Connecticut and the nation. This series provides firsthand accounts of high-profile municipal climate programs, climate initiatives in the corporate world, new greenhouse gas reporting frameworks, statewide sustainability programs, low-carbon fuel initiatives, and other programs and projects that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve climate resilience. Today, we're excited to have Hella Granoli, Associate Research Scientist affiliated with the Center for Business and Environment at Yale. Ms. Granoli will share the results of a recent study on the feasibility of renewable thermal technologies in Connecticut. The webinar will focus on the study's findings and recommendations for market opportunities to advance the adoption of renewable thermal technologies as a means to achieve the state's ambitious carbon reduction goals. The presentation will be about 40 minutes long, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. If you have a question, go ahead and submit it using the dialog box, and we'll read it aloud for Hella to respond to. Before we get started, I do encourage those of you listening via your computer speakers, if you're experiencing poor sound quality, to go ahead and call in by phone. Often the connection is better that way. And then with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Hella, and thank you again for your willingness to present, and looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to present the study that we have been working on. We are all concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, and Connecticut has ambitious targets for 2050. And heating and cooling are buildings that represent around 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions in Connecticut. And our study gives new insight into what role renewable thermal technologies can play in reducing greenhouse gas emission until 2050. There are barriers that we have mapped, and there are also solutions, and this presentation will discuss that. This study is a result of a cooperation between the Connecticut Green Bank, Eversource, United Illuminating, and Yale through the Center for Business and the Environment. And DEEP has also contributed in an advisory role to the study. We are in the final phase of publishing 2 reports. They will be released within 1 or 2 weeks. And one of them would be estimating the market potential for the renewable thermal technologies. And the other one documents a field study that we have done on barriers and drivers. We will make sure that these reports will be distributed to all of you after this webinar. Before going into the details of the study, I would also like to mention that there are several methods for analyzing greenhouse gas emissions. Our analysis relies on the methods and inventory of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, IPCC. And I just want to mention that Connecticut relies on a more conservative approach when accounting for emissions from biomass. And I will mention the implications of one method over the other where it's relevant in the presentation. In the next 40 minutes, I will tell you about the findings of the 2 reports, and I will start with the background for the study. Why do a feasibility study for renewable thermal technologies? Greenhouse gases related to thermal demand in buildings amount to 12.6 million ton CO2 per year, and I think that's a good reason for it. We will discuss the potential and rationale for renewable thermal technologies, and also see that these technologies have a large potential market till 2050, estimated in the range of 100 to 140 trillion BTUs. There are both economic and non-economic barriers to this potential, and we will discuss how barriers such as high upfront costs, lack of awareness, and installer business models impact the potential. I will close the presentation by discussing some possible solutions in order to increase the deployment of renewable thermal technologies. This is an overview of the different aspects of the study, and I will walk you through the three parts. So the first part of the study was to estimate the technical potential. How big is the thermal demand today and projected till 2050? In other words, trying to estimate the size of the cake to be shared among the different thermal technologies. The second part is estimating the economic potential. Letting the thermal technologies compete and figuring out which are most competitive from an economic perspective, and what is economically feasible given this competition analysis. And we have included 7 different customer categories into this analysis. And in addition to that, we have tried to map different barriers and drivers that can restrict the economic potential. These are both economic but also non-economic barriers. And just to say where the reports are oriented, the quantitative part of the study is documented through the market potential report, and the barriers and drivers is documented through the field study report. The technologies that we have included in our case studies include air source heat pumps for space heating and cooling, both with and without costs of ductwork. We have included air source heat pump water heaters. We have included ground source heat pumps for space heating and cooling, solar thermal for hot water supply, and biomass represented by pellets. In the project, we have defined renewable thermal technologies as technologies that harness renewable sources to provide heating and cooling services. This means that other solutions than those that we have included in the competition analysis is also available. And I would like to say a few words on that. Our analysis has focused on decentralized solutions, but I would also mention that thermal grids represent an opportunity for further studies and deployment strategies. That's why I also included waste as an example in these pictures, and also power generation. Because thermal loops could facilitate the utilization of waste heat from waste incineration and industrial processes. I would also like to mention that we have taken a whole thermal demand approach in the competition analysis. That means that the smaller plug-and-play air source heat pump solutions are not included. To start projecting the future, it's also useful to know where we stand. And we have estimated the thermal demand for residential, commercial, and industrial sector to 200 trillion BTUs in 2014. Residential demand is represented by the outer ring, commercial sector by the second, and industrial sector by the innermost ring. And residential sector represents the largest thermal demand, 120 trillion BTUs, and as you can see, has a relatively large share of fuel oil in the energy mix. We could also see that commercial sector has a large share of natural gas. 70% of the thermal demand in the commercial sector is covered by natural gas. Industrial sector is not included in the further analysis, but I would like to highlight that the industrial sector do represent an interesting segment for renewable thermal technologies. You could also see that there's a share of fuel oil of 35% in this sector. We have estimated the current greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector to be 12.6 million metric ton per year, and we will have a closer look to what different scenarios will imply for that later. Now let's turn to the 2050 projections of thermal demand in buildings. And before I go through the main findings, I would like to mention that there are a number of assumptions behind this analysis. And my presentation will focus on the findings, but I would be happy to answer any questions about the assumptions in the Q&A session. While the base case suggests a thermal demand of 126 trillion BTUs in 2050, our sensitivity analysis show a range between 103 and 142 trillion BTUs in 2050. The lower estimate represent a sensitivity analysis with ambitious building codes and a higher rate of retrofit, and the upper numbers or estimates represent a case where we have where the outdoor temperatures don't change relatively to today. We have found that ambitious building codes may considerably impact on the thermal demand. This is particularly the case in the commercial sector, where the rate of new construction is expected to be high. We have also done sensitivity analysis on the outdoor temperatures. We have applied the expected changes in the annual energy outlook, which assume that the winters will become warmer and the summers will become warmer. However, that change will give a reduction in the thermal demand of around 15 trillion BTUs per year by 2050. It's sort of a free pull for lower demand that is caused by higher outdoor temperature. Energy efficiency is also important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector, and we have established a path where we assume that the whole reduction of greenhouse gas emissions related to thermal demand is caused by energy efficiency measures, and that would require a considerable number of buildings undergoing deep retrofit per year. And we have tried to estimate this rate and found that between 5 and 5.5% of the building stock would have to be deeply retrofitted per year. And then we have defined deep retrofit as reducing the thermal demand by 75%. And this would be a very high, or it would be a high rate. Let's have a look at the base case and a selection of the sensitivity analysis done for residential thermal demand until 2050. And this graph underlines the potential related to a higher rate of retrofit in the residential buildings. We have included 4 different paths to 2050 in this illustration. We have the base case, where we could see that the thermal demand is expected to move from 120 trillion BTUs per year to 87 trillion BTUs per year in 2050. Second, there is a sensitivity analysis with an ambitious building standard for new homes. We have assumed passive house standard. Third, a sensitivity analysis assuming that all homes undergoing retrofit is deeply retrofitted is included. And as I said earlier, we assume that by deep retrofit, 75%, there is a 75% reduction in the thermal demand. And fourth, we have included the minus 80% path. And with the exception of the 80% path, we can see that the deep retrofit path shows the lowest residential demand projections for 2050. And the reason why retrofit is so important is that the rate of new construction in residential sector is relatively low, which deviates somewhat from the commercial sector, as we can see on this graph, where we can see that ambitious building codes may cause a larger difference. We have included 4 similar paths in the commercial sector as in the residential sector. First, the base case, where we can see that the commercial demand is expected to go from 50 trillion BTUs in 2014 to 37 trillion BTUs in 2050. Second, we have included a sensitivity analysis with ambitious building standards for new construction. We have assumed a higher rate of retrofit, and then fourth, the minus 40% path. And because the analysis assumes a higher rate of new construction in commercial sector, a stricter building code will make a large difference, resulting in a thermal demand that is 19% lower than in the base case. But I still would like to claim that even with strict building codes and a high rate of retrofit, there will be a large thermal demand in 2050, which represent a potential for renewable thermal technologies. Before I go into details on how the various renewable thermal technologies compete to the conventional technologies in today's market, I would like to give an overview of the procedures that we have followed through the study. We have started out finding the financially most competitive technologies for 7 different archetypal customers, and I would like to mention those. It's single-family home, it's apartment building, education, food service, healthcare, hotel, and office. And for all of these 7 archetypal customers, we have calculated the net present value for different combination of incumbent technologies and proposed new renewable technologies. And the incumbent technologies that we have included is fuel oil boilers, standard natural gas boilers, and conventional electric technologies. And on the renewable thermal side, we have included air source heat pumps, both with and without ductwork. We have also included a case where we look at air source heat pumps for water heating in residential sector. We have included ground source heat pumps, solar water heating for hot water, biomass pellets for space heating and water heating, and in addition to the renewable thermal technologies, we have also included highly efficient natural gas boilers as an alternative. And after having done the competition analysis and found out which alternatives are most economically favorable, we have used the technical potential to split the demand between the various technologies. I would also like to mention that our analysis does not include existing financial incentives. We have chosen to include financial incentives as part of the sensitivity analysis. This example of a single-family home shows the alternative, the various combination of incumbent and renewable thermal technologies and how they result. And we can see that heat pumps and solar hot water are economically feasible solutions to replace conventional electric technologies. I would like to give some explanation to this graph. It's fairly complicated. The net present value for each alternative is shown by the orange bars, and the values can be read on the left-hand axis. The reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions for each alternative is represented by the blue dots, and the value can be read on the left-hand axis. And from left to right, you can see the air source heat pumps alternatives, first without ductwork, then with ductwork, and then for water heating. Then followed by ground source heat pumps, solar hot water, pellets, and last, the highly efficient natural gas alternatives. And you can see that heat pumps and solar hot water as an alternative to the conventional electric technologies have positive net present values. However, the graph also shows that the renewable thermal technologies will struggle more to be competitive to fuel, oil, and natural gas. You can see that on the bars that goes below 0. Highly efficient natural gas boilers, though, seem to be competitive. And as the biomass pellets alternative appear with high number of reduced greenhouse gas emissions in this diagram, I would just like to mention that these numbers would be lower if the method that DEEP applies was used. This overview of the operational fuel costs for heating provides an insight into why the different alternatives turn out with a negative or a positive net present value. For the net present value of a renewable thermal project to be positive, the operational cash flow of the renewable alternative has to be higher than the operational cash flow of the incumbent alternative. And otherwise, it would be hard to pay back the installation costs, which often tend to be higher for the renewable thermal technologies than the conventional thermal technologies. And this is what makes this illustration interesting. The operational fuel cost, and what we mean by that is we have the price of the different fuels, and we also take into consideration the efficiency of the various technologies. And you can see that the operational fuel costs of conventional electric technologies, here shown by the blue solid line, that the conventional electric for heating is expensive. And it's so much more expensive than the other alternatives that replacing electricity for thermal purposes makes economically sense. You could also see if you install an air source heat pump, the operational fuel costs would go down, here shown by the blue dotted line. And if you have a greenhouse ground source heat pump, it would be reduced even more, here shown by the dotted green line. But you could also see from this graph that both fuel oil and natural gas prices are low for the time being, and that will make it challenging to many of the renewable thermal technologies to compete. I would like to draw your attention to the lower green or solid green line. Though we have combined two technologies. We have combined a ground source heat pump with a solar photovoltaic installation, and we have assumed that the installation cost of this solar PV installation is $2.5 per watt. And just to put it in perspective, the solar PV market currently sees installation cost at $3 per watt. So combination of technologies may provide a good case. This slide shows the results from the competition analysis for all 7 archetypal customers. And just to repeat which those are, it's a single family home, it's the apartment building, it's education, food service, health, hotel, and office. But I would like also to add some explanation to the table. The first column shows which renewable thermal technology is being studied, while the second column shows the incumbent technology that is being replaced. The positive net present values are marked green, or the cases with positive net present value is marked green. Yeah, and basically shows where the renewable technology is financially competitive to the incumbent. And we can see that heat pumps generally are financially favorable to conventional electric technologies. We could also see that pellet boilers replacing fuel oils are financially competitive in several commercial sectors. And if we look at the result of this competition analysis and relate it to the technical potential, we estimate an economic potential for renewable thermal technologies in the current market of 19%. In the next couple of slides, we have analyzed the greenhouse gas emission implications of 3 different scenarios, starting out with the residential segment. And we can see from this diagram that a variety of different measures, energy efficiency, a high deployment of renewable thermal technologies, decarbonizing of the electricity, as well as the deployment of highly efficient natural gas boilers are necessary to reach the 2050 targets of greenhouse gas emissions, which are shown by the lower orange line. The current greenhouse gas emissions has been estimated to 9.1 million ton in the residential sector, and by applying scenario 1, which means that we introduce all the renewable thermal technologies that are competitive today, we could achieve an immediate reduction of 0.6 million ton CO2. And this scenario would follow the red solid line. If we include the competitive efficient gas boilers and let they first take the market where they're most competitive, and then also add the competitive renewable thermal technologies where the gas boilers have no role, an immediate reduction of 2.4 million ton CO2 could be achieved. So that would follow the blue solid line and be represented by the number 2. However, we can see that there's still some way to go to the target, and we have included in scenario 3 some of the renewable thermal alternatives that are not competitive in the current market, and have deployed greenhouse gas, ground source heat pumps as an alternative to fuel oil, and then applied efficient gas boilers for the segment where there's currently standard gas boilers, which would bring us down to the pink solid line and contribute quite a bit. If we, in addition to that, reduces or decarbonize the electricity grid and assume that there's a 75% renewable electricity being applied, that would add a reduction of 1.2 million ton CO2 by 2050, and which would bring us close to the target. But just highlighting that a variety of different measures would be necessary to get to the target, which would also imply deploying technologies that are currently not competitive from an economic perspective. Achieving the 80% target is even more challenging in the commercial sector, as can be seen from this graph. And one reason for that is the high share of natural gas, which would make it harder to make the economic case for change. And the current greenhouse gas emissions for the commercial sector is estimated to 3.5 million ton, and then we have done the same exercise for commercial sector as for residential sector, where we first introduce a scenario representing all the competitive renewable thermal technologies, which would give an immediate reduction of 0.8 million ton CO2, represented by the number 1 in the graph. And then we have also established a scenario 2, where the highly efficient natural gas is also allowed to compete for the technical potential, and that would give an immediate reduction of 0.7 million ton CO2. If we in scenario 3 replace the remaining fuel oil with ground source heat pumps, and then switch all the standard natural gas boilers to highly efficient natural gas boilers, we would follow the pink path and scenario 3, which would bring the greenhouse gas emission to 65% of what it is currently. With a high share of decarbonizing the electricity supply is also important, and a 75% renewable electricity mix would add a reduction of 0.4 ton. But we could see for the commercial sector that there is still some way to go down to the target. I would also like to mention that a more conservative approach to greenhouse gas emissions from biomass will lift all the scenarios upwards, and which would leave a larger gap between the 2050 and the scenarios, which is particularly the case for commercial sector because biomass turned out as a competitive alternative in the competition analysis. As we can see from this diagram, some parameters influence the net present value more than others, and particularly that's particularly the case for the fuel costs. That really makes a difference. And we have done several sensitivity analysis looking into fuel costs, increasing the costs for the incumbent technology, reducing for the new technologies. We have looked into a case where we look at heat pumps in combination of solar PV. We have also done sensitivity analysis around the initial cost, a 25% reduction. We have studied part load strategies where the installation for renewable thermal is lower, and we let the incumbent technology deliver thermal or heating on the coldest days. We have also looked into some alternatives around thermal renewable energy credits, similar to what they have in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And then also carbon price of $41 per ton, which is represent the social cost of carbon estimated by the interagency working group. We have looked into different financial structures, debt interest rate, debt terms, and then last we have looked into various combinations. And I would like to show an example from the sensitivity analysis, and this is a diagram where we have a combination of different measures at the same time, and that will we can see that this combination will improve the competitiveness of the renewable thermal technologies. A small explanation to the diagram. The green cells represent the alternatives that were competitive in the base case, and the orange cells indicate the cases that turn competitive with the changes that we have made in the parameters. And in this case, we have reduced the initial installation cost by 25%. We have assumed that the electricity costs of heat pumps are lower through the installation of solar PV. So we have reduced those costs by 25%. And we have assumed that the fossil fuel costs are 50% higher. And just to add as a historic note, the average residential fuel oil prices increased by 50% from 2009 to 2012, and in 2015 the fuel oil prices were down 2/3 of what they were in 2012. So you can see that the prices, the fossil fuel prices, traditionally have been volatile. And what you can see here is that a lot of new alternatives become competitive towards fuel oil. So for instance, heat pumps are competitive towards fuel oil, and so are some of the solar water heating alternatives and ground source heat pump alternatives. So now I want to turn to a broader picture of challenges faced by renewable thermal technologies. And we have the field study that we did supports the finding of high upfront cost as one of the main barriers to renewable thermal technologies. There are two aspects to that barrier, and one is the issue of renewable thermal technologies having higher installation costs than the conventional alternatives. And the other is the need for large capital outlays upfront. As one of the institutional customers put it, we cannot afford to pay extra for environmental value, and the project has to be zero out of pocket. Another issue that was mentioned by a few residential customers was the issue of a tax rebate or an incentive that's credited at a time, at a different time than when they have their expenses, when they have to pay for the installation. The problem is when you put everything up on your roof, there's an outlay of money and you're cash poor until the tax rebate is returned. And I would like to just mention some strategies to break down high upfront cost in the next slide. And using the single-family home, replacing conventional electric by ground source heat pumps for that. In the upper left-hand corner, we can see the base case with a positive net present value of almost $6,000. And you can see the cash flow in this picture. You can see the annual cash flow over the lifetime of the technology. And you can see in the base case that the customer has to raise quite a bit of money up front in order to achieve the benefits coming later. Then we go to the right, to the upper right corner. We have reduced the initial installation cost by 25%, which will improve the net present value, but it also reduces the need to raise money upfront and generally improves the cash flow. And I just wanted to mention a few alternatives or solutions that will give this impact. We have Solarize for thermal. The Solarize CT campaign for solar PV gave a 13% cost reduction in the installation cost of PV, and we have similar examples for soft cost reduction on the renewable thermal technologies. You would achieve this impact through subsidies and also tax credit. If we go to the lower left-hand corner, in addition to the reduction of the initial cost, we reduce the electricity costs by installing solar PV, which improves the net present value even more and lifts the cash flow too. And these are some measures that would give this impact on the cash flow, packaging with solar PV as shown here, but you would also have a similar effect by having a carbon price, thermal renewable energy certificates, or a favorable interest rate. And what if you, in addition, have a 100% debt ratio, or try to say that the cash flow shall always be positive? That can be done through different financing products such as the debt ratio and leasing, but also various business models such as thermal service agreements. So So far, the focus of the presentation has been on the economic barriers. However, there are also a set of non-economic barriers, and I will mention the most important of those. It seems like this market is, or the renewable thermal technologies is suffer from a deficit of awareness, and we had the impression from the interviews that there is also a confusion between what a renewable thermal technology is compared to solar PV. And as one of the installers said, PV is killing solar thermal. The payback for solar thermal technologies with the tax credits is good, but it's not as sexy as PV, which also speaks to the issue of the so-called neighborhood effect as a driver for increased deployment. But focusing only on economic issue might also be a drawback because the renewable thermal technologies can offer more than just energy, and this can be seen from a comment from one of the program administrators. When we talk to customers after the fact, they never talk about energy savings. They are always thrilled about how comfortable and quiet the home now feels. It's an interesting transformation. Forget the savings, we know how comfortable our home is. Industry structure and business model represent another barrier. This market seems to be thin and immature currently, and with the exception maybe of some air source heat pumps. And one result of this is that customers are skeptical to investing in the technologies because they perceive it as a risk that the constructor may not be in the business long enough to provide long-term maintenance services. And as one of the institutional customers said, the energy service companies are typically incentivized to choose projects that are most easily executed and can guarantee savings with relatively short payback periods, which leaves out several of the renewable thermal options. And furthermore, this institutional customer had the impression that the workforce need to be developed in this sector. One of the residential customers that we interviewed had implemented several measures at the same time as installing the ground source heat pump. And as you can see from the quote, business models helping the customer to benefit from a mix of different measures do offer opportunities. So I'm about to wrap out my presentation and would like just to add some concluding remarks. And I think we have seen that to get to the targeted greenhouse gas emissions, the thermal demand has to be targeted with a mix of both regulations and incentives. And there need to be a considerable reduction in thermal demand, which can be influenced by, for instance, the building code. And there has to be an increased deployment of renewable thermal technologies, which can be incentivized through, for instance, soft cost strategies, combination of different measures as shown in the sensitivity analysis. A decarbonized electricity generation, we have particularly taken interest in the combination of heat pump and solar PV, both for the greenhouse gas emission impact, but also for the potential economic impacts of it, but also some highly efficient natural gas boilers to it. And with that, I would like to thank both the partners of the project and also the team of Yale students that had delivered a valuable contribution to the study. Thank you.
Thank you, Hella. That was an excellent presentation and a great overview of both studies. So we did have a few questions come in, a couple clarifying questions. One being the classification of highly efficient natural gas as a renewable energy. Can you just clarify that it was not classified as a renewable energy, but why you guys analyzed it?
Since natural gas is so competitive, we wanted to include that to see what that could bring as one of the cheapest alternatives. And what we assume when we added highly efficient natural gas boilers is that they have an efficiency of 95%. So we just wanted to add that as an alternative to the renewable thermal technologies to see what that could bring compared to the renewable thermal technologies.
Great, thanks. And then can you talk a little bit about biodiesel and how and why that didn't play a part of the analysis, or if it will in the future?
Yeah, biodiesel. Well, we never really discussed that in detail, but my experience from biodiesel is that so if biomass has issues, there's also issues to biodiesel because you have to be sure what's actually from where it comes. You have to have a certification system to make sure that it's actually correspond to sustainability criteria, and yeah, there's different issues related to that. But I think biodiesel, the thing is that you could use a fuel oil boiler for that with some adaptation depending on the type of biodiesel that you apply. So the installation cost would be the same, but you would have most likely have a more expensive fuel. So I think we could, based on the analysis that we have been doing, we could discuss what would be the implication of biodiesel.
Okay, great. And then can you talk a little bit about partial deployment of renewable thermals? I know you didn't cover it in the presentation. It's covered a little bit more in the report, but can you talk about why you didn't look at that more specifically?
Well, we have added to the analysis a case study on that, and what we have done is to show what a part load strategy would lead to. And what we did is that, so the shape of the heating demand of the year, you have a high peak, and then you have it flattens out. So that means that often you can design the renewable thermal technologies to cover 60% of the load and still assume that it delivers 80% of the thermal energy demand, which would make the whole case better from an economic perspective. And then you could let the incumbent technology cover the peak, cover the days where with the lowest temperatures.
Okay. A couple more questions. Can you, going back to the efficient natural gas, can you tell us the difference between a highly efficient gas boiler and then the I guess fairly efficient boilers already being sold? What's the, sorry, they're typing some more. What the difference is? Like, what's you just mentioned 95% efficiency for a highly efficient. What is I guess a standard?
Yeah, so we have used an average efficiency of 82% for the standard efficient natural gas boilers, and then 95% for the highly efficient natural gas boilers.
Okay, and then can you go back to the slide where you lay out the air source heat pumps that were analyzed? It said that you mentioned that certain plug-and-play air source heat pumps were excluded from the analysis. So can you clarify that a little bit?
Well, what we have assumed in our analysis is that the thermal technology covers the whole load of the building, but we are well aware of that you have smaller units that can deliver heating and cooling to parts of the building, for instance, single rooms or more rooms, but still not the whole building. So so that's why I said we didn't include the smaller units, which could offer, which could be easier to install and implement than the whole load solutions.
Sure. Okay, great. And then there's just kind of a clarification of the findings. Your presentation seemed to say that highly efficient gas boilers will be a better financial choice for most property owners transitioning from existing gas or oil boilers. Is this correct?
Yes, that's what our net present value analysis shows, yes. Not necessarily competitive to standard natural gas boilers, but fuel oil, yeah.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have. If anyone wants to write one more, you're welcome to. But the report should be out in the next week or two. That's correct, Hella?
Yes, that's correct.
And it's a much more, obviously we couldn't do all of the graphs and charts and all of the information that's in the report, but it's much more comprehensive than the presentation that was given today, and we will make sure that we get that sent out to everyone for you to take a closer look at. Hella, if you go to your last slide with your contact information, folks can contact her with additional questions. We will have this recording on our website. So feel free to pass it on to others who were unable to participate today, and we will also post a PDF of the slides. Does not look like I have any other questions. So thank you so much, Ella, for your presentation. That was really fabulous.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And I just want to give I guess a shout out for the next webinar series. We haven't posted on our website, but will be posted soon. We'll be highlighting the states and giving an overview of the state's Lead by Example program. That's scheduled for March 9th from the standard time that we do it from 12 to 1. So I encourage you to tune into that as well and learn about how the state's reducing energy consumption within state buildings and municipalities. So with that, I'll go ahead and sign off. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Stay safe. It looks like it's snowing quite a bit out there. Have a good day. Thank you.